Hi everyone, my name is Pratik Naik. I'm an editorial and commercial retoucher, and today we're going to talk about something that is really important, especially for me, and I think a lot of photographers out there because they don't think about this, and that's going to be how we can take the images that we shoot on studio and bring them into post-production and how our lighting choices can affect that. So for example, how do you know whether you want to use a soft light or a hard light? And what differences does that make when you bring it into post-production? And specifically for me, whenever I take an image and start retouching, I notice a couple of things. Number one, hard light images always have a lot more detail. Why is that? Why do soft light images always look softer when it also comes to detail? It can be lens choices, but lighting has a huge role to play in that. So today we're going to look at two different modifiers and how it actually impacts your lighting decisions. Firstly, we're going to be using this ELC 125 monolight, and this is something that I use all the time in my shoots just because of how easy it is to carry around. It's really compact and versatile, but also extremely powerful. It has a nice LED light as well. For those of you who know that I like to shoot with the LED a lot when it comes to adding in some fill during natural light shoots, and I can shoot wide open with that as well. The first modifier we're going to use with that light is going to be this Elinchrom umbrella, which is a 105 deep white umbrella, and it's something that I use pretty much as a really nice versatile modifier that I can travel with. And it's nice and compact when you break it down. It's also great when you modify and adjust the location of the light with this on. So you can get really nice soft light, hard light, just depending on how far or close it is to the subject. The second modifier we're going to use is a standard reflector. It's something that people overlook a lot because a lot of people do have it. However, I think because it gives a nice hard light, you can do so many different things with it, whether on its own or in combination with a fill light. As I mentioned, we're only using one light, and that's because once you master that, you can do so many other things like start adding fill, accent lights, and all kinds of good stuff. However, it's important because we're going to take those images into post-production after we're done shooting to show you what type of results we're going to get at pour level so you can make better decisions accordingly. Keep in mind, besides the light properties itself, you have to focus on what is the mood of the shoot going to be. For example, today we're shooting my beautiful wife, Bella, and she's a fantasy and fairy tale photographer, and she's wearing this really beautiful dress where it has tons of detail. Now, the lighting choice can also impact, texture and sharpness. However, it can also impact the mood. So you're going to see how using the umbrella versus the reflector and what type of mood it invokes just by looking at the image. So let's get started. The first actual modifier we'll use is the umbrella. It's something that I think is extremely versatile, as I mentioned before, but can also be used for beauty, for fashion, for any genre of photography. All right, now my favorite part, we're actually on the shoot itself. Keep in mind, because of quarantine, we weren't able to actually have a videographer film me shooting. So what I decided to do instead was I decided to film B-roll in the position of me actually photographing the subject. So you can see a clear view of how everything looks in comparison to where I'm standing. Then I start to move through and you can see the different angles of light based on how she's posing. And I thought this was really interesting because you're not only able to get an idea of how it looks while I'm shooting her directly, but also you get a very good sense of what it looks like as I'm moving around Bella. And I think this is important because with this one light, you can very visibly see how the properties change based on the position that you put the light. And I think that's extremely versatile because on a shoot, I normally do this. I go around the subject and change it up, and without moving my light, I can get completely different looks with just one light alone. Keep in mind though, that we did have a wall on the left-hand side, so it added some nice fill, which you'd normally do with a standard reflector or things like that. So it kind of added to the softness of the whole scene here. I feel like for anybody who's a photographer, having a standard umbrella like this is an essential part of the kit just because of how versatile it is. Now that you've seen kind of what this setup looks like, let's go to the next one, which is going to be our standard reflector. This is something that is one of my favorites because of how versatile it is again. It's easy to carry and take with you and pack, but it doesn't get in the way and it's not going to tip over your light either. And you can notice here specifically how different this is because yes, it is a hard light, but it creates a nice little spotlight effect in the center. So it's great for jewelry and creating accents across your image. But also, I love the way it falls off as well. And I love this because almost looks like there's two lights in one going on here. You'll notice that the transitions are harder and there's more contrast going on. And then when you go into post-production, you're going to see exactly how these two differ, especially with the details like this. Now that you've seen a before and after of these two setups, let's jump into Capture One to show you how the files look. Now that the shoot is done, I've gone ahead and brought our examples into Capture One. Keep in mind, I've done a couple of things as a full disclosure or disclaimer, whatever you want to call it. I've edited some of the skin in Capture One in terms of healing. I've done a little bit of healing for the blemishes because I obviously don't want her to, feel conscious about that. And I've gone ahead and even out some of the blotchy areas of the skin with Dodge and Burn. So what that means is I've not touched the texture properties of the image. I've not done any modifications in terms of global lighting. I've not increased the highlights or decreased the shadows. The only thing that I've done aside from that was on the image on the left, I've gone ahead and reduced the exposure just a little bit because I overexposed the image. And I can probably do the same here for this one if we wanted to base it on the highlights. And that I think looks a little bit more consistent with each other if we want to do that as a starting point. And if you can imagine already, the image on the right here is the one that I used the standard reflector on, and the image on the left here is the one that I used my umbrella. And you can already tell based on the actual eye what the modifier was. And if I go ahead and take the loop tool here in Capture One and zoom in and show you, you can see it's a smaller light source there. And over here, it's a larger light source. And it's a little bit feathered too. So if you notice from shooting, I actually feathered the light a lot. And I like to do that because it kind of gives me even a softer look. One thing adding to the softness of this particular image is going to be the wall that was on the left-hand side, which actually made me come in a lot closer when I was doing the video. And it adds to the fill of the light coming in. So keep that in mind as well. One thing that I didn't have here was a fill light, but you could have some bounce coming in from the wall, which was a lot less obvious just because of the direction of the light and the fall off that happened from the reflector. It falls off quite fast. It's not a soft or diffused light, so it didn't have a lot of spread going on based on the size of the light as well. If I didn't have the reflector on, I would have gotten a very hard light, but it would have also been quite diffused in the sense where light would have been bouncing everywhere, and maybe it would have, come back and filled in the shadows a little bit more. But that's, again, something to experiment with if you have a bare bulb and you want to see what that kind of can do to your image in compared to having just a reflector. Also, interestingly enough, the reflector provides a different power output too, so I had to adjust my power output on the flash. So aside from that, let's take a look at some of the properties here. And one thing I noticed is that with this image on the left, firstly, let's talk about the hair. You can see the highlights on the hair almost turn into like midtones, if you will, because if I hover over this area here and you look at the top where you see the numbers in red, green, and blue, which is 64, 61, 61, which is almost quite neutral. It's my red, green, and blue numbers, which tells me if there's a little bit of a influence of a particular color, which in this instance, it's showing me there's a slight bit more of red, which could just be the white balance or, things like that. Or there might be a subtle tinge of red in the hair naturally. I didn't use a color checker or anything like that. These were just straight at the camera. On flash white balance. Now, the settings that I use for these photos were f11, as you can see here, at 125 and 200 ISO for this one. And for this one, I did f11 at 100 ISO. I don't know why I did 200 for this one, but it is what it is. Anyways, aside from that, you can see the transitions fall off quite gradually with the umbrella here, and over here, the transitions fall off quite fast, and there's a lot more contrast. Now, if we begin to, say, zoom into these particular images, let me come over here and show you what I'm talking about. You'll notice that even in the hair itself, the quality of the hair looks dramatically different. And this is interesting to keep in mind. So if you are doing, say, a hair campaign, there's going to be a lot more contrast with this setup. And you'll notice that it's seemingly a lot sharper, and we are zoomed into 200%, so it's a lot further than you should be zoomed in terms of looking at detail like that. If you want to get a true quality of pixel level, which is 100%. So you'll see here that there's more tonal differences even within each strand of hair. So if you're doing hair campaigns, it kind of depends what your mood board is and what your reference point is. So if you have a reference point, keep that in mind for the kind of contrast that you're going for. Now, it's not to say that you can't bump up the contrast here, because if I click on this, for example, and increase the contrast and increase the exposure, you can, kind of start getting that kind of high key look going, but you can see it's not the same. It's not the same. The highlights are just more pronounced, and there's definitely some midtones and then transitions into the shadows. However, with this one, it's just kind of, an imitation, if you will. So I wouldn't recommend doing that too. Let's zoom out again really quick and take a look at the fall off here on the face. I'll zoom in again a little bit here and again over here. And the position of the face, I try to keep as similar as possible, obviously with the different hand expression. But what you'll notice is a couple of other things. Number one, on this image here, let me go ahead and bring this center. And I might zoom out just a touch. No, let's just keep it zoomed in. What you'll notice here is that the highlights themselves might be a little bit bright. Let me decrease the exposure so you can see a little bit better. So the transitions are nice and soft, and over here the transitions are quite quick. And it gives the face a different illusion altogether. The dimension's different, even though we kept the same 50mm lens for both of these pictures. You'll notice that the way the light wraps around it creates a different dimension. This is very important because if you're shooting somebody who is more conscious about the shape of their face, then you want to experiment with both, because although the soft light here can kind of soften the transitions between the shadows and highlights, which normally is very pleasing, it can create the illusion that the face is a lot wider than it is. So sometimes hard light, even though it's not considered flattering, can be flattering based on the position of the light and the kind of shadow play you want to do. So for instance, over here in this image, the face does look a lot slimmer just because of the way the shadows kind of wrap around it. And the question becomes, what is better? And the answer is, there isn't an answer. The answer is, what are the qualifications that require you to do your job the best that you can and the look that you're after? For me, I decided what kind of mood I wanted to, and then decided, where I want to place my light. For me, I like the straight on angle, generally speaking, or I should say not straight on, but off to the side just a little bit, so I can get the nice dimension coming here on the side. And the same thing for the umbrella. I just felt that for her, the position of the light based on her face was something pleasing for both lights and modifiers. Then I decided what dimension I wanted. So, the placement of the light, the modifier, and the angle all interacts with each other in terms of what you want to do. And for me, I felt like the position was perfect, and then the modifiers enhanced the shadows of both of the images. Now, the other thing to note is that the highlights will also pop very differently. Just like the hair, the skin has similar properties in how the transitions are happening, especially in the highlights. So if you look at the nose here, for instance, you'll notice that there's a nice highlight that's happening here, and there's a nice highlight happening here, which enhances the pore detail. Now, of course, I'm zooming in past 100, so, don't worry about that. But just to give you an idea, the shadows and highlights, even with the mid-tone contrast here, look very, very different. The pores are pronounced very differently. So for instance, even here between the highlights and the midtones, you'll see that there's more diversity and variety with the tonality going on. You'll see there's more midtones happening at pore level, but over here it softens up the pores and some of the lines just differently, because just like the hair, the highlights are not as intense. So what's happening is the midtones kind of blend into the highlights a little bit more, which causes softness, or the appearance of softness. Even though it's not soft, I shot them both at f11 and it's a very sharp lens, but the illusion of light, or I should say the light itself, creates illusion of softness when you look at both of them. That's very interesting to note. Another thing to note is catch lights. So if we look at these catch lights here, how bright do you want your catch lights? How big do you want your catch lights? And One thing I like to do to fool people sometimes is swap catch lights. So I might take a catch light from here and add it to here just to give a bigger catch light, but people won't understand, how I'm creating a harder light using a bigger catch light. So it's kind of like a mind trick, if you wanna call it that way. And this is both good to analyze because if you have makeup that looks very different for both the shots, you want to keep those things in mind too. Anyways, zooming out here again, I think those are the biggest differences when you look at both of these images in terms of the mood that you're going for, the contrast that you're going for, and the possibility of the file. And also, when it comes to raw files like this, and the big reason I wanted to keep this in the raw stage is because they both have different possibilities. So for instance, on the one on the left here, if I was to bring up my shadow detail here like that, it's going to look very different to when I bring up my shadow detail here. So you can see that even though you're bringing up a shadow detail on the hard light image, it's not going to make a hard light image look like a soft light image because clearly it doesn't look like this. And what's happening is because the transitions are so sharp, it's trying its best to bring up the shadows. However, the deepest, darkest shadows can't be brought up because they're clipped, which means that the information is lost. And you'll notice because if I try to do that, you'll see it come through, but it's breaking up so badly that I would consider almost unusable, even though it might be there, and it's not. And this also depends on the file or the camera that you're using too, so keep that in mind. But anyways, the point being is that the transitions here on the umbrella are so gradual that even the shadows have a gradual transition. So when you lift up the shadows, it has a different possibility. Just by seeing it, I think is a better example than just by talking about it. So you can see here, it's a nice and gradual adjustment. And on this one, the adjustment is okay, but you still get that contrasty property of the image overall. So those are the couple of things to keep in mind. And color grading is another aspect of that. You could actually have different options when it comes to color grading. So for instance, on this one, because the transition between highlights and shadows are actually quite, I would say, soft, if I actually did some color grading, which will go to the color balance tool here in Capture One, if I say my highlights, I want to push it to more warm tones and I'll push my shadows to more cooler tones. If I do the same thing, say to both of them, let me go ahead and see if that actually works. And I'll go ahead and apply this. So I applied the exact same color grade to both of them. So you can see how the mood just looks completely different, even though the color grade is the same. And that's because, again, if you look at it, the way that the color plays within the highlights and shadows looks completely different. For this one, I thought the highlights would actually register in the hair too, but it doesn't seem to be doing that too much. Maybe if I go ahead and adjust the exposure, it might actually increase. Nope, I was expecting the yellows to kind of pop into the highlights of the hair, but it didn't really do that. So I'll go ahead and put it back to where it was. Anyways, you can see here that the highlights look different and the shadows look different. And also the transition, how fast it goes from yellow to blue is much faster, since of course the transition from highlights to shadows are much faster. The other thing to keep in mind here, aside from the color grading, which I'm going to go ahead and reset, I'll say reset adjustments to both of them. And I'll go and zoom in here to our details of the dress, is the details themselves look a lot different too. And there's not a ton of details to notice just by looking at this particular image, but you'll notice that based on how soft the lighting is here and how hard the lighting is here, the details pop differently. The details on the chain look different. There's much more specular highlights that transition to the shadows quicker, as opposed to this one where the highlights kind of stretch a lot further across the chain. And that creates the illusion of depth as well. And the same thing goes for garments and these little beads that have smaller highlights compared to these ones that have larger highlights. And the color again also changes based on that too. The blues look deeper here because they're in the shadows compared to the highlights, or there's more of an intricate transition even at the fabric level, where some of the fabric might actually be brighter and some parts of the fabric might be darker, as opposed to an image like this over here, where everything starts looking very soft and equally lit, just because at fabric level, everything is smoothed out. So the fabric itself might look less textural just because of the way it's lit. I hope this video gave you a really good idea of how hard and soft light can impact not only the mood, but what it also means for post-production, so that next time you can make the best decision for your footage.